This mother recently gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Both parents couldn't wait to cuddle their wonderful little baby, but suddenly the doctor noticed something unusual. "I've never noticed anything like this in my entire life." All was quiet in the delivery room. 15 minutes later, everything was noisy and everyone was screaming with happiness. But when the doctor arrived and announced the surprising news, the atmosphere immediately became tense. The newborn's parents had no idea what was about to come. Their newborn had been taken to another room for examination. The doctor was giving directions that they didn't quite understand. "I've never seen this before." But when he explained to the parents briefly what was wrong, the mother was shocked. She instantly knew something the doctor and her husband did not yet know. "I have to tell you something," said the newborn baby's mother.
Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story.
After years of trying and trying came the great moment of happiness that 35-year-old Dana and 36-year-old Tom were expecting. Their first child had come into the world. Dr. Friend would simply check their little Jess, and after that, Dana could finally hold her little miracle. It had been 9 months of excitement and miracle, so the new parents were impatiently counting the days until Jess arrived. They were so happy the delivery went smoothly. Dr. Fred even told Dana that it had been the smoothest delivery she'd ever experienced in her entire life. "Sometimes a baby just wants to come out," he said. What followed after that would leave everyone in the room in shock. Dana had always dreamed of having children even as a toddler, and as she got older, the biological clock began to count down. Children were the center of her happiness, and so it were for Tom, who came from a family of 7 children, of which he was the oldest. So he had to take care of his brothers and sisters, and it was there that he discovered the great pleasure of parenthood. They both looked at each other and couldn't wait for the doctor to come back from the usual checkups at birth. Suddenly, the door opened and the doctor, without Jess, immediately noticed their look of concern. Both parents looked at the doctor in complete shock. With a photograph in his hand, he walked over to Dana's bedside. "Where's Jess?" he asked her. The doctor walked over to Tom and Dana and showed them the photograph. It was a picture of little Jess in an incubator. "There's something wrong," Dr. Friend warned them in a concerned voice. Confused, he pointed to Jess's head. It was clear the doctor hadn't seen this before. Dana looked at the photograph and began to cry. Incredulously, she burst into tears. The doctor and Tom were in shock at her reaction. "I have something to tell you." The doctor and Tom waited for Dana to calm down. It was obvious she was very terrified. Tom had never seen his wife in this state of panic. Almost stuttering from panic, Dana began to tell them the story of her grandmother Carla. Tom had never heard this story before. Dana's grandmother had never been a big topic. This was the first time he'd heard her talk about her. Dana would simply say her grandmother had passed away without details. However, now pointing to Jess, she told him the full story, and Tom listened intently. When Dana got to the key moment in the story, Tom put his hands to his mouth. From one moment to the next, he was completely irate. The room was completely silent. Everyone was upset, even the doctor. Tom and Dana looked hopelessly at Dr. Fred. They wanted him to tell them in advance what was going on. Was there anything that could be done about it? The nurses stood around the bed with a look of terror. Obviously, they'd never witnessed anything like this before. The doctor announced to them right away that he would get to work on little Jess. He warned the new parents that he would do everything he could to fix the problem. Dana had little faith in them. She was the only one who knew how her grandmother had ended up. Dr. Friend and the nurse came out. "Come on, we have to act fast." Dana and Tom were still in shock. All they hoped was that it wasn't true. They'd hoped that Dana's grandmother hadn't infected their baby. Before the other nurse got ready to examine Jess closely, she turned to look at the parents again. She saw that they were completely upset, and she'd rarely seen parents so tense. "We'll do our best. Luckily, we know the source of the problem." Tom and Dana hugged each other. Very tense, they dropped into each other's arms, waiting for an answer. Suddenly, Tom asked her how her grandmother had ended up. "Please tell me your grandmother Carla had made it out okay?" Grandma Carla was Dana's mother's mother. They had an excellent relationship. From a young age, they connected very well. Almost every day they spent time together. When she was about 10 years old, Dana started playing the piano. Her grandmother taught her the best tricks of the trade as she had played in an orchestra. While the connection they built while playing the piano was unbreakable, Dana became one of the best pianists in her country in the years that followed. Under her grandmother Carla's coaching, every orchestra wanted her. It was the beginning of a wonderful career. But suddenly something happened to grandmother Carla. From then on, Dana never played the piano again. Dana played the piano until she was 18. Grandma Carla motivated her more and more, so much so that little by little she imagined herself playing piano at the famous Sydney Opera House. She had to train hard every day to make it, but with her grandmother by her side, that was no problem. Unfortunately, as she realized her grandmother began to behave strangely, she gradually stopped accompanying her to her rehearsals and performances. Normally, she was always in the audience. One day the two were playing the piano. Grandma Carla noticed that Dana began to notice it. It was so clear she could no longer hide it. "Stop playing, honey. I have something to tell you," her grandmother mentioned. It was very strange. Grandma Carla was no longer telling her about mistakes while she was making while playing the piano. Sometimes Dana would deliberately skip a note to see if her grandmother noticed, but she didn't. Grandma Carla told Dana that a few months earlier she'd been diagnosed with Meniere's disease. That disorder had completely changed her hearing. She now suffered from attacks of dizziness and vertigo and saw her sense of hearing diminish drastically. Dana observed her ear and noticed that it had a different shape. After a while, Grandma Carla became completely deaf. As a result, she couldn't hear what Dana was playing on the piano, which caused Dana to lose motivation and give up the piano for good. Tom was very moved when he heard the story. It was unbelievable that he'd never told anything about this. He knew Dana could play the piano extremely well, but not that her grandmother had been behind it all. Dana simply said it was too hard for her to talk about it, especially after only a few years before they met. Tom understood and was hopeful that everything would work out with his Jess. Whatever happened, he'd love her just as he loved Dana. They both gave each other a tight hug. The doctor came in and very slowly placed the baby in Dana's arms. With a relieved tone, he let them know that all was well. Meniere's disease is minimal in little Jess, so there's nothing to worry about. We checked her very well and there doesn't seem to be anything unusual inside her ears. There's nothing wrong with her eardrum. Fortunately, it was just in her earlobe. A few months later, Dana returned to playing the piano. She noticed that every time she played it, little Jess enjoyed it. It seemed that fortunately her grandmother Carla hadn't passed on her illness to Jess, but her talent for the piano.
If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who may find it interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.